So would you please help me in welcoming Dr. Robert DiSilvestro?
As you can tell, I've got a very diverse background, and in the course of my little talk today, that diversity is going to come out because it gives me a lot of different perspectives on issues regarding design and issues regarding God and beliefs. So I'm just going to start out by saying that when I talk to people that don't believe in God or aren't sure what they believe in, usually they ask me about one of three criteria for belief in God. It's usually either about scientific evidence or about faith or about experience. And I've come to the conclusion that, at least for me personally, my belief in God derives from all three. And I think it's dangerous to just do any one without the other two. So, for example, some people will come up to me and say, well, I don't know what I believe in, but I only believe in things that can be demonstrated by the scientific method, and I really don't have any use for believing anything by faith. And my response is, so you only believe in things that you know by the scientific method. So use the scientific method to tell me that you like chocolate, or you love somebody, or you root for the Browns, as Gracie kind of made me And I said, that's something you can know all three of those things, even though none of them are proved by the scientific method. Or if you say, well, I don't do anything by faith, and I think, well, how did you pick out your college, your major, or if you're married, your spouse? I bet there was some faith involved in those decisions. So I reject the idea that evidences by themselves, scientific evidences by the scientific method, are the only ways you can know anything or you can know anything about God. Also, if they would tell me something like, well, you got to prove this to me just by scientific evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, I come back to the same thing. Whether you do everything based on evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, those things I just mentioned, taking a job, picking a spouse, those are things you do, and you make decisions about them even though you don't have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a certain amount of faith involved in that. Or then I get the people that just say, many of them are scientists, just say, well, this is just a matter of faith. It's just believing in something without the evidence or even in spite of the evidence. And that's it. I'm a scientist, but science can't tell us anything about whether or not to believe in God. And I hear that a lot. I've seen it in journals like Nature. And my response is, who passed that law? Why can't scientific evidence be used to learn something about God? And so the one extreme is science only. The other extreme is faith only, without any evidence. And my response again is that yes, science can tell us something about evidence for God. For example, we can look for evidence of design in nature. That's not unscientific. For example, we have something like forensic science that tries to differentiate between accident or design. You can apply those same principles to questions about whether there's design in nature. So I reject the idea that you can't use science at all to look at whether or not a belief in God or a particular kind of God is reasonable. So I reject the idea that science is the whole answer, but I also reject the idea that blind faith is the whole answer. And then there's experience. I've had people say, all right, forget about the faith, forget about the science part, but if I could just have a sign. I have a slide I don't have with me today that I use sometimes for that, where it's this sign on the side of a road, and it said, well, you asked for a sign, God. It's this big billboard on the highway. But in any event, some people say that. Well, they say, well, I've read a little bit of the Bible, and I read where this guy named Paul was riding along on his horse, and God knocked him off the horse and blinded him, and then 3 days later his sight came back. If that happened to me, then I believe. And I think, again, experience can play a role. And I'll talk a little about that just a little bit. But be careful what you ask for. Yes, Paul did have that experience, but Paul wasn't completely an unbeliever. He actually believed in God. He just needed his beliefs adjusted a little bit. But also realize that this person, Paul, also went through some horrendous things. He was shipwrecked several times. He was beaten and left for dead. He was eventually beheaded. So, God gave him a pretty good evidence based on experience, but he also went through a whole lot too. So I kind of reject the idea that any of these by themselves are the ultimate answer. I think all three is what, at least for me, makes up my basis for believing in not just God, but also the God of the Bible. Okay. So basically, in my own life, my own belief in God, and particularly the God of the Bible, is 90% based on objective evidence. 10% of it's based on faith. That's already at 100. For me, the subjective experience has been more about confirmation. I didn't really use that in the beginning. I became a born-again Christian in college. I was raised in a traditional church, but then, it's the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, and everybody questioned everything. I was no different. I questioned my beliefs. And at that point, I finally came to a decision to put faith in Jesus Christ as God, based 90% on objective evidence and then 10% on faith. I couldn't quite get it to the beyond all reasonable doubt phase, but I got it to where I was close. I made that other 10% jump by faith. And then for me, the experience followed later. They wouldn't necessarily convince anyone else, but there were confirmations to me that I made the right decision. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the first one, just examples of objective evidence. But then I'm going to talk just a little bit about faith, because I think a lot of people have the wrong idea of what faith is, just like that person I mentioned who said faith is believing in something without the evidence or in spite of the evidence. And faith is actually a way you can know something, and it goes beyond just blind faith. That's one type of faith. Speaking of the Browns, like the blind faith would say the Browns are going to go 16-0 next year. Not a lot of evidence for that. Some of this has nothing to do with anything, I'm going to say it anyway. There's a Men's Health magazine I read, and people write in about physical as well as psychological health. Someone wrote in, they were from Cleveland, Ohio, and they wrote in and said, I can't watch a pro football game anymore unless I bet on it. Do I have a problem? And the person answered, only if you're betting on the Browns to win. Anyway, a blind faith statement is that the Browns are going to go 16-0 without the evidence. But there is faith that's rooted in evidence that's different than that, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So, again, these are my three bases for my beliefs, and I'm going to try to talk a little about each one, but spend most of my time on the first one. What I'm basically going to do is give you the short version of 6 evidences. I have more than 6, but that fits my time slot pretty well. So I'll go through 6 evidences. I won't go through all the counter-arguments and all the rebuttals to the counter-arguments. I'll just try to give you some basics. And at the end of the talk, if you're interested, I've got some things that have a little more detail, and I'll give you an easy email to remember that you can actually email me, and I'll send you more details on these. All right, evidence number 1. Let's just start, where did it all begin? It all began with a big bang. A TV show tells us that. And this was one of the evidences that really convinced a well-known atheist who was someone that spent a lot of his life debating believers like William Lane Craig. And he very vehemently said there is no God. And finally, when he was very old, and he just died a couple years ago, he changed his mind. And he wrote this book. His name is Anthony Flew. And he wrote this book that says there is no God, with a no crossed out replaced by an A. There is a God. And he said he basically became convinced because of all the scientific evidence. He said, I just plain couldn't get around the scientific evidence, and it just made way more sense for me to believe in God than not to believe in God. And one of his evidences that he looked at was this idea of the Big Bang. That's how the universe was supposed to have started. What does the Big Bang say? The Big Bang basically says the universe hasn't always been there. It came from nothing, turned into something at one point in time. And when this Big Bang happened, when suddenly we went from nothing to something, the initial something was extremely tiny, and yet it unwrapped with mind-boggling precision and formed the stars, the planets, and eventually what we see today as the universe. And the precision at which it fell out was incredible. So how can you explain that the universe had a beginning, that it came from nothing, and it fell out with this unbelievably incredible precision. The simplest explanation is to say that a superintelligence we call God did it. And it would have to be a personal God, because if it was an impersonal God, the universe should have always been there. Why did it just start at one moment in time? And it would have to be a God that exists outside of space and time, because that God would have to start time and space. And it turns out the Bible is the only ancient holy book that actually talks about a God that exists outside of space and time. The other ancient holy books, God's kind of part of the universe. So that's the most reasonable explanation. There are people that have tried to argue you can have a Big Bang without God. I've never understood the arguments, but Albert Einstein said you couldn't have a Big Bang without God. He was pretty smart, so I think I'm in good company if I don't understand the counter arguments of how you could have a Big Bang without God. So again, the universe started as this very small little speck and then expanded. And sometimes it's been described by astronomers as it was like you have a tent in a small package and you unwrap the tent. Or another way it's described sometimes, it's like a curtain that's kind of folded up and you stretch it out. The universe essentially, you could describe it either way, and they both make sense depending on which part of the Big Bang you're talking about. It unwraps like a tent, or it's stretched out across it stretches out like a curtain. Well, interestingly, although the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, was written back in the BC days, there was this poetic language used, and it's a little dangerous to read too much of the poetic language in the Bible because it's poetic language. But when the poetic language reflects a way of thinking that would be totally foreign to people that were living at that time, I think that's evidence that maybe the Bible was actually just divine. And there's a lot of examples I can give, but I'll give this one, Isaiah 40:22. It says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." Does that sound like something I just said? It's a great description of the Big Bang, and yet it was written at a time where obviously nobody had any idea what the Big Bang was. So evidence number one, the universe started with the Big Bang. We got something from nothing. It fell out with incredible precision, and the most reasonable explanation is that a superintelligence named God did it, and the God of the Bible is the only God talked about in ancient writings that fits the bill of a God that exists outside of space and time, and this poetic language of the Bible that very well describes the Big Bang. So that's my evidence number one. Evidence number two is a big word, the anthropic principle. You know, scientists like using big words, it makes us sound smart, so I know a few multi-syllable words, anthropic principle, delicatessen, a few others. What does the anthropic principle say? It basically says that there are constants of physics and properties of the universe that have to be pretty much exactly what they are, or we couldn't possibly have life on Earth. For example, this is just one of many examples. There's something in physics, I did pretty well in my college physics classes, and we learned about the nuclear force, basically what holds the nucleus of atoms together. And if that nuclear force was just 0.5% weaker, we would have no hydrogen, no water, no life. On the other hand, if it was just 2% stronger, we'd have no protons, and the only element we'd have would be hydrogen. Couldn't have life that way either. So this constant of physics has to be exactly what it is, and there's just a whole string of examples like this. Also, a lot of the properties of astronomy, the positions of the stars, the planets, even the mass of the universe has to be what it is, or Earth would not be well positioned to have life. Stephen Hawking one time made the comment, he's a famous astronomer, and he made the comment that he didn't believe in the God of the Bible because the God of the Bible was very careful and precise, and there's so many stars out there in the universe that don't do anything that the God of the Bible wouldn't have wasted his time making all those stars. Well, it turns out one of the anthropic principle properties, or one of the examples of the anthropic principle, is that the mass of the universe has to be what it is. Even though we're over here, all these stars are over there, they got to be over there. That the odds of having one planet that could support life are incredibly small. In the mid-90s, the journal Nature ran an article called "On the Likelihood of Inhabitable Worlds," and it basically said, we better not mess this up because it's so unlikely there's anywhere else that works. And it said, how can we explain this? And the article in Nature said, well, the best explanation is some super intelligence we call God did it. And then it says, kind of like what I said a little earlier, but that's outside of the realm of science, so we've got to figure something else out. And again, I'm going, why is it outside the realm of science? Who passed that law? And so they came up with some crazy explanation that didn't make a lot of sense, but even they admitted that really is the most straightforward explanation. So, evidence number 2, the anthropic principle states that it really appears that some superintelligence set up the laws of physics, the constants of physics, the properties of the universe from an astronomy standpoint, set it up so this one little tiny planet could have all the conditions just right to have life on it. So again, that's evidence for God. Can you come up with some other explanation, like we were just really lucky, or had people say, well, the anthropic principle works because we wouldn't be here if it didn't work? I don't find that very intellectually satisfying, but I've had people say that to me. So, is it absolute proof for God? Again, you can judge that for yourself, but I think it's a very strong evidence, and that's what I'm trying to present. I'm trying to say that my belief in the God of the Bible is 90% evidence. So I think this number 2 is another part of my 90% evidence. Why the God of the Bible? Well, the God of the Bible is depicted as the kind of God that would set things up extremely precisely. For example, in Psalm 147:4, it says, he determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name. Now, we see each by name, is that like naming the reindeers that Santa Claus had? No, in that kind of literature, if you name something, it means you're assigning some particular importance and individual importance to each one. So again, when this was written, yes, that's somewhat poetic language, but why that language? It's just not something an ancient mind would necessarily think of. And I think, again, it backs up the idea that the God of the Bible would be a God that would explain the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is evidence for a God, but I think passages like this in Scripture are evidence that this is the God. Third evidence is the origin of life, points to a designer. I'm doing a lot of design in my work now. I got 2 startup companies, neither of them making money yet, but I'm doing designing of biological products, somewhat at the interface of nutrition and pharmacology. And I realize how challenging it is even to design something that's as narrow as what I'm trying to do, let alone designing life. And there's many reasons why the origin of life points to a designer. I give whole talks on this subject. So I'll just talk about one reason. One reason is what's called ordered complexity, because we have unbelievable ordered complexity in life. And the question is, where did it come from? And really, any scientist who's honest with you will tell you there aren't any good existing natural explanations. Even Darwin did try to tackle this one. He just said, I don't know where life started, I'll just tell you how we got the origins, which you could argue that, but even he didn't try to tackle this one. And most scientists, if they're honest, will just tell you we don't have a great explanation from purely natural standpoints. So what is ordered complexity? This is a lot of order, but not much complexity. Dogs play Scrabble and they each spell ARF all the time. That is order, but it's not much complexity. Now this is the Scrabble player's nightmare. That's a lot of complexity, but no order. This would be ordered complexity. You've got something that makes sense. Now, I give this talk at Ohio State. I don't use Scrabble. I do patterns in the sand. And I said, these ruts are kind of interesting, but you know, there's complexity to them, but not order. And then I show something else. And then at this slide, I put up Go Ohio State Buckeyes. And I say that's ordered complexity. If you saw that written in the sand, you would assume there was intelligence behind it. Then I put up Go Michigan Wolverines and said, of course, there's no intelligence. But for the Akron crowd, I use the Scrabble analogy. So that's ordered complexity, and life has unbelievable ordered complexity. So how did that come about in the first place? And what you hear a lot is, well, given enough time, even a monkey at a typewriter could type a Shakespeare sonnet. And it doesn't even have to be one particular sonnet. We didn't even go further than that, just any sonnet. given enough time, this was something Anthony Flew used to argue. The guy I mentioned that wrote the book saying he changed his mind late in life about whether there was a God. And he used to use that argument. He said, just given enough time, even a monkey at a typewriter can type a Shakespeare sonnet. If I keep him around for billions of years, it'll work. But he ended up later in life saying, that was really a crummy argument. There's just not enough time. And one example has to do with proteins. Now I say protein, you might think of like muscles and bodybuilding, and yes, there are a couple of structural proteins in our skeletal muscles, but there's hundreds of proteins in our body that have nothing to do with the muscles. There's hundreds of enzymes, there's antibodies, there's all kinds of proteins in our body that have all kinds of functions. And they're made from amino acids. Amino acids build proteins the way letters build words and sentences and books. So the different orders can mean something or it can be gobbledygook. So a protein, its function, if any, is determined by the order of the amino acids. And for the most part, you can't change the amino acids. Now, if you look at this illustration, this is just a short sequence of amino acids. Number 6 in this particular sequence has a little wiggle room. So an oyster version of this protein might be different than a rat, which might be different than a human, because there's a little bit of wiggle room on some of them, but most of them there's no wiggle room. And even the ones where there are wiggle rooms, there's just very, very small amounts. So for the most part, you got to line these amino acids up in the right order for them to have a particular function. Just like if you line up the letters and just randomly start typing on your computer, most of the time you don't print out something like, to be or not to be. Most of the time you just print out gobbledygook. Well, the same thing is true with proteins. If you just start putting the amino acids together randomly, most of the time you don't get anything that would have any functional value. And that's been shown a number of different ways. There's some studies done with recombinant DNA, there's some studies done some other way. And basically all 3 ways that this was tested came out with pretty much the same idea. And it said for the average length protein, only about 1 in 10 to the 64th power sequences would be good for any kind of function. Because sometimes I've argued, well, what's the odds of getting one virus that would be functional? And people say, well, that's like saying, what's the odds of getting this one winning bridge hand? Why don't you talk about the odds of getting any winning bridge hand? This is the odds of getting any winning bridge hand. This is basically saying for an average length protein, the odds are 1 over 10 to the 64th power, or 10, not over, but 1 in 10 to the 64th power. That's a 1 with 64 zeros after it, millions of 1 with 6 zeros after it. So that's infinitesimally small. Basically, the odds are essentially 0. And that's one protein. Even viruses have a couple hundred proteins. And people debate whether viruses are alive or they're just the lowest form of life. Well, some people argue the academic teams are the lowest form of life. Anyway, those of you not academia, maybe I'll relate to that. Anyhow, the point is that this is just one protein, and you've got to get it a number of times. How did it work the first time? And I'm not even introducing things like all the amino acids have to be left-handed. That's a whole other problem. How did you get them to be left-handed and not a mixture of right and left? But this is saying that even if you have all the amino acids, you can hook them all together, the odds are essentially 0 you could ever get one to work. Now some people say, yeah, but don't we have a lot of time? Well, yeah, from our perspective, but not from this perspective. By the oldest estimates, the universe is 10 to the 18th seconds old. So even if you do this 1,000,000 times a second, you're still at like a number of 10 to the 40th power. So it's still essentially 0. Even if you could do this 1,000,000 times a second, the odds of getting this right once are infinitesimally small. Now, I did have an international student once say to me, yeah, but a lot of unlikely things happen all the time. When somebody wins the lottery, I said, yeah, but the odds of winning a lottery are in your favor compared to this. But there's another way to think of it. Yes, some unlikely things happen. Somebody has to win the lottery if they set it up. Some of the versions they don't, but if someone has to win, yes, it's unlikely that one individual would win. And yes, some unlikely things happen. But when you look at something very unlikely happening and you see evidence of design, we usually conclude that it was designed. So for this to have happened not only once, but a number of times over, and it come out functional, that would be evidence of design. So to use the lottery example again, okay, somebody won the lottery, that's not that amazing. But if 5 lotteries in a row were won by somebody that was related to the person pulling the balls out, you would say there's evidence of design there in terms of who won. So yes, unlikely things happen, but when you have something that's this unlikely and it results in design or apparent design, then we would say that is evidence of design. Again, keep in mind, it's just one protein. But there's another problem in addition to just the stats. I love stats. As a biochemistry student, I never had a stat course, but when I started publishing in nutrition and pharmacology journals, I had to learn real fast how to do stats. So I love stats, and this is an example of statistics, saying the odds are so ridiculously small, they're essentially 0. But there's another problem too. You need the machinery to do it. Apart from the stats, you need the machinery to actually compose it. And there's all kinds of problems which I don't have time to go into. Like I said, getting all the amino acids left-handed and not a mixture of lefty and righty. How do you hook them together? How do you keep the protein from breaking down? There's all kinds of issues with that. You just plain don't have the machinery to do this. Somebody said, what about natural selection? So you don't have natural selection until you have life. You can't have natural selection here. So there's not the machinery, or a lack of machinery. And somebody once told me too, well, you get some things that appear really complex at the end, but if you get everything to happen just right at one time, it can work. And if we have enough time, maybe that would happen. I already told you about the time part. But I also said you don't have the machinery. So well, what about an arch? You know, you put them all together, you glue them together. Once it's together, yeah, if you knock one piece out, it all falls apart. But look, you can build an arch, and you know it's very complicated, and you just have to have a lot of things happen at once. And I said, what has that got to do with my argument that you don't have the machinery for this? For an arch, you have a floor, you have cut pieces of stone, you have cement, and you have people putting them in. That's all machinery you don't have in making that first protein or that first life form. So for a whole lot of reasons, I've just given you a small slice of it. I think Origin of Life points to the idea that we need a creator to do this. Now, one of the arguments, I get back to this too, another argument is, well, it's just a God of the gaps. Whenever you can't figure something out, just say God did it. Like in the early days, if it rained, they said, why did it rain today? Well, God made it rain. You know, not anything to do with meteorology. But there's a problem with that. This is not a God of the gaps. Yes, we don't know everything, but we already know a whole lot. And what we know says there's no good natural explanation for origin of life. That's not God of the gaps, that's God of knowledge. We have knowledge. Do we know everything? No, but we already know enough to say there's not a real good explanation here. And so, what if we discover this? And I haven't turned the tables and said, well, you're arguing for, let's say, Darwin evolution. You're arguing for that. What if we find out that these were all wrong? Well, no, that's different. We already know this. You know, they like to play both sides of the fence sometimes. We know enough to support my conclusions, but we don't know enough to support yours. Anyway, no, do we know everything? Did something happen to change our mind? Possibly, but that's what I'm saying. This is, I believe in God 90% based on evidence. I think the evidence is very compelling in the 3 I've already given you, but are they absolute proof? For me, they were pretty close, but not quite. But I think they're compelling arguments. Also, why the God of the Bible again? Come back to another thing here for the God of the Bible creating life. Well, there's a lot of things I could say, but I'll just say this. When the Bible talks about creation, it's talking mostly about the who, not the how. But there's some interesting things in Genesis, and I don't have time to go through all of them. I'm just going to mention one. It mentions that humans and animals were made from the dust. We look at that and say, so what? That's not very profound. In 400 BC, that would have been really profound. There was a thought then that the earth is made of one set of building blocks, animals are made of another, humans are made of another. Actually, we know we're all made of the same elements. So to say that there was a common building block for the earth, animals, and humans would have, again, been something that an ancient mind would not have thought. So once more, I think there's an argument for God, and then the Bible has comments that make me think, well, the God of the Bible is the God that did this. Okay, number 4 of 6 here. Resurrection. Again, a whole talk's going to be done on this. I'm not a historian, but I do evaluate testimonial evidence, as was mentioned in the introduction. I sometimes do some studies on some alternative medicine, and I got to decide, is this worth writing a real research grant for, or is the testimonial evidence kind of garbage? And I'll look at that, I'll look at what makes testimonial evidence good, what makes it bad. You know, I felt a little less tired, and not real impressive. So, you know, I look at some things. On the other hand, you know, I had blood tests done on my immune system, and it got better, okay, a little more interesting. So, what makes good testimonies? Again, I could give a whole talk on this, but I'll just mention a couple. And the resurrection of Jesus, as is told in the Bible, is a key to the Christian religion. If there's no Easter, Easter was the day Jesus is said to have resurrected. If there's no Easter, there's no Christianity. There's a nice code of ethics, but there's no Christianity. That Christianity, you have to have Jesus dying, buying a pardon for people's sins, and then rising again to show that he was divine. If you don't have that, you don't have Christianity. Well, it turns out that, again, the resurrection hits some of the highest standards of testimonial evidence. For one thing, testimonial evidence is impressive if it's coupled with some objective evidence. Well, all four Gospels report an empty tomb after Jesus died. And there's no other competing writings that dispute that. And even many of the liberal theological historians now concede there was an empty tomb. They try to come up with some crazy mass hallucination explanations, but most of them will concede now there was an empty tomb. Once you concede that there was a tomb Jesus was put in when he was dead, and then the tomb is empty, you have a really hard time coming up with any other good testimonial evidence other than Jesus actually rose from the dead. For example, why would the followers have made this story up? There was no reason to. It brought a grief, not anything tangibly good in terms of a natural reward. You really have a hard time then coming up with any other good explanation. Another thing is, who gives the testimonies? If somebody is testifying about something and they're extremely biased, or there's somebody that's a celebrity that, you know, if I say it, everyone's going to buy this, I take that with a grain of salt. You know, my favorite football player says, "This is why I shave with rides." You know, you shave with rides and you just paid to shave with it. That's dating. Anyone remember Ride's shaving cream? I don't think that's around anymore. But you know, so who's giving the testimony is often the criteria for how good is testimonial evidence. Well, the Gospels mention a number of the testifiers. One of them is someone named Joseph of Arimathea. It said he was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were the group of Jewish leaders that actually went to the Romans to have Jesus killed. And they said that he didn't agree with the decision, and was not part of it, and that he was the one that actually provided the tomb. All four Gospels say this. Again, there are no competing written stories saying it didn't happen or there was no Joseph of Arimathea. If you're going to make something up, you don't name the person, and you don't say he was a member of the opposing group, because they would immediately say there is no Joseph of Arimathea. So that's very good testimonial evidence that this resurrection actually did happen, that there was a grave that was given and it was empty. Also, the first witnesses of the resurrection are reported in the Gospels to be women. If you're going to make this up and you're living in around 30 AD in the Roman Empire, in a Jewish culture, you do not say women were the first witnesses. In the Roman culture at that time, a woman's testimony in court was considered so worthless it couldn't be used. Why would you say women saw the resurrection first? The only reason you would do that is if it happened to be true. And Jesus apparently didn't care about the Romans' tradition that he appeared to the women first. But it's not something you would make up. So those are examples. And again, this could go on and on. It could be a whole talk. I'm just giving you a little smidgen here. But these, I think, are evidences of why the resurrection story is true. It was reported in the Bible, in the Gospels, and referred to in some of the letters that appear in the Bible. And I think it's a strong evidence that the God of the Bible is God. Fifth evidence is the spread of the early church. As I mentioned, I now have some startup companies, and I've had to learn about marketing. I never had a course in marketing, but I've had to learn about marketing. And when I put on my marketing glasses and I look at the spread of the early church, I say, this makes absolutely no sense that the church is spreading. it really makes no sense from a marketing standpoint. There was no financial reason the early church should have spread like it did. They had no military leverage, none at all. You look at the early spread of Islam, they had a big army behind them, kill off your enemies. Christianity didn't have any of that. There was no political power advantage to doing this. There was no powerful endorsement backing. None of Caesar's officers or government people came out and said, hey, do this, this is good. They suffered tremendous persecution. But they were not separatists. There are people that suffer persecution but are separatists. They were not. They stayed in the main line of society. Something else you just don't see very often. They also insisted on a physical impossibility. They kept saying that our faith is centered in Jesus dying for our sins, paying our price, the penalty for sins, dying, and then rising again from the dead as evidence that he was divine. That's something that's physically impossible, and yet they stuck to that story. Even when they were persecuted and killed, the eyewitnesses stuck to that story. So none of this makes any sense whatsoever from any kind of a marketing perspective, unless it just so happened that God was actually behind it. So actually I said I had 6, I only gave you 5, shortchanged you 1. But there are plenty of others I could have talked about, a number of other areas. But just to summarize the ones I did talk about, the creation of the universe. Simplest explanation is that God did it, and the way the Bible was written support the idea that that was the God. The anthropic principle, evidence that a superintelligence monkeyed around with physics and astronomy to give us a planet we could have life. Again, strong evidence for God, and wording in the Bible written by ancient writers that didn't know modern science gives evidence that the Bible was inspired when it talked about its version of God, which again to me is evidence that this is the God. Origin of life, no good natural explanations. We see something that statistically makes no sense and shows evidence of design. Generally in real life, when we see that, we assume design. I assume design in this context for the origin of life, and again, things that are in the Bible support the idea that that God was the one that originated life. The resurrection of Jesus meets the highest standards of testimonial evidence, and the spread of the early church makes no sense from most perspectives that you could come up with that would give natural explanations. To me, the most reasonable explanation is that God was behind it. So those are examples of evidences that have helped shape my belief and got me 90% of the way to saying, I believe in God, I believe in the God of the Bible. But then there was still this thing of faith. As compelling as I feel those evidences are, and some of the other ones I didn't talk about, nonetheless, I can still say, maybe I can still come up with some way of thinking that you can have all this without God, without the God of the Bible. So I made that 10% leap of faith. It wasn't blind faith. I got like 90% by evidence, but I still had the 10% jump to make. I made that jump by faith, not blind faith, but faith based on evidence. So a lot of people will say, well, then you just, really it is based on evidence, but it's not based on any way of knowing anything. That's not quite true. We actually put faith in people all the time. Oh yeah, I got that. Sorry, see, I had that cartoon. Is there ever enough proof? That was the question I asked myself when I said I believe in God 90%. How many evidences do I need before I believe 100%? I finally decided maybe there weren't enough evidences in the world to ever get to 100%. I can get close, but never 100%. Do I still need more proof? And as I said, I ended up coming back to faith. So 10% of my belief is faith, which is basically a trust in another person. Now you have to be careful who you trust. You don't want to trust the wrong person. That's not someone you want to put your faith in. On the other hand, there are people you put your faith in. I hope there's at least somebody you trust to some extent in your life. There's a person I do some work with occasionally. She's a former professor. She's now in the nutrition industry line of work, and I call her or visit with her pretty regularly. Her name's Stacy Bell. She lives in Boston. And I don't know much about her personally. Until 6 months ago, I didn't know her husband's name or how many kids she had. Don't know what she believes spiritually. But there's something about Stacy that I know I can tell her something that is extremely confidential, that I don't want other competing companies to know about. And I can tell Stacy, and I know she won't blab it. That's faith. How do I know that? I can't explain it, but I do know it. It's not blind faith, but it's faith, and I just can't put a scientific formula to it. I can't do a math proof, but I have faith in Stacy. I just know she will not blab. Now, I've never met Jesus in quite the same way as I've met Stacy, but I have read the Gospels, and I've read the epistles in the book of Acts, and when I read about Jesus, it inspires faith in me. Very similar to the same way I have faith in Stacy. I can't explain it, but I've talked to Stacy and I just trust her. Jesus, when I read about Jesus in the Bible and I see how he said different things and did different things, I get that same sense. There's a faith that rises up in me and I say, I really want to follow this person, even though I've not met him in exactly the same way as I did Stacy. I just love this mixture of compassion and wisdom and knowledge. So my 10% then that I couldn't quite fit with science, I fit with faith after reading the Gospels, encountering the person of Jesus in those pages. So with that, I made this leap of faith and decided I believe 100% in the God of the Bible, in Jesus. What about experience? Now, there are some people that part of their belief is based on experience. For me, it's been more about confirmation. God can do it any way he wants, and there are times he helps people believe by giving them some unusual experience. In my case, I got those after I believed, and I think that's the more common pattern. Experiences by themselves are not great evidence because, boy, it would take this one moment to decide I wanted to update things. People claim all kinds of experiences, and a lot of them just don't make a lot of sense scientifically. Like most of the UFOs, I just talked about the anthropic principle. There's no planet anywhere near here that could have life. Where did these people come from? These people from outer space. Nonetheless, there are people that will claim those kind of experiences. So people have all kinds of experiences. And just taken by themselves, it's hard to have objective truth. But again, I've got my scientific evidences, I've got my 10% faith, and then for me, my experiences have bore out that I made the right decision. And as I just said, some people get the experience first, and that helps them believe. God does seem to do that occasionally, at least based on what I read in the Bible. Most of the time when that happens, it's an adjustment rather than going from no belief to everything, because in a way, I'm just thinking myself, if God forced you to believe without any kind of a hard attitude where you didn't really want to follow him, I'm not so sure that's a good thing. So, you could say one false step, all right, just cripple the right foot, cripple the left foot, okay, get the left foot, hit the right foot. That would be pretty impressive. But if I really didn't want to believe in God or follow him, I think I feel almost gypped, like you just forced me to believe in you and I really don't want to follow you or believe you. Nonetheless, God can do whatever he wants. He could bring people to faith that way, but it seems to be the exception rather than the rule. And it seems to happen when someone already has a hard attitude to follow him. Most of the time, I think it's the other way around. He doesn't really give these amazing signs as fun as they would be before we believe. So a lot of people would say, well, in terms of experience, if you show me, I'll believe. And God is usually saying more, why don't you believe and then I'll show you. And that's been my experience. It's been more the, I believed and then he showed me. And these kinds of experiences don't necessarily prove God to anyone else, but they're very good confirmation to me. I'll just give you one quick example and then I'll close and answer questions. A few years ago, I felt like God was really pushing me to take a stand on certain things and act a certain way and do a certain thing. And I really felt like, yeah, this is right, but I don't like it very well. And I started arguing with God and saying, at least I argued from my end, I don't think he argued back, but I said something like, this is correct, this is right, But, you know, why do I have to do this? It seems like you're being arbitrarily strict. And I grew up with parents, they got married very young, they were not even quite 19, they had me like 18 months later, and they decided to be very strict with me. My sister, not so much. But one of the things they were very strict on was bedtimes. I mean, I never set an alarm till late high school because I went to bed so early. I was woke up waiting for the bus was going to come. And you know, first, you know, people say, "Oh, that's funny," but it really got traumatic for me. I didn't like it in the summer when I was 10 years old and it was 8 o'clock and I was in bed and my kids were still out playing my friends were still out playing baseball. So one time, this is an appropriate time to tell the story because the Winter Olympics are going on. The first year I got interested in the Olympics was 1964, and those are when the winter and the summer were the same year. And I was 10 and a half at the time, and in those days you didn't have the deluge of TV coverage you have now. In fact, for the first 4 days, you just had these little 15-minute capsules that would, in black and white, that would give you the highlights of what happened that day. Well, I don't remember what time they were on, but the first few days were out of the question that I could stay up and watch it. But then the last one was a Friday night, and I thought, you know, my mother, even on Friday night, sometimes makes me go to bed early. Maybe I could pull this off. And my father had a sales job at the time, and he was on a rare Friday night sales call. So he was out of the house. It was just my sister, who was really young, and it was a small house, but I just stayed out of sight as best I could. And so whatever time it was like 8:15. It wasn't exactly midnight. I snuck out to the television, turned it on real quietly. It was just starting, the 15-minute summary of the highlights of that day in the Winter Olympics of 1964. Just put it on. My mother walks out. She goes, "I know it's Friday night, but you've been tired lately." I'm never tired. I go to bed at 8 o'clock all week. But you've been tired. You need to go to bed. And I normally didn't argue, but in this case, I said, "It's the Olympics. I really want to watch this. It's not on that long. It doesn't last that long. No, you're going to bed." Off I go to bed. My father comes in, and he's like all mad because he did the sales call, and then they didn't buy anything off him after they told him to come and see him on Friday night. And he was all upset, and he ranted for a while, and then he said, "Oh, he asked if I was already in bed, because it wasn't that late." And she goes, "Yes, I know it's Friday night." He was tired, and so I told him he had to go to bed. He was arguing with me because he wanted to watch the Olympics. My father said, "The Olympics? The Olympics aren't important. Me not making the sales important." And they both came in and started yelling at me that I would care about the Olympics when my father lost the sale. I'm only 10 and a half, but I was logical even then. I thought, all right, if missing the Olympics would have made you got the sale, that's fine, but it's nothing to do with one another. I even thought that. I was logical even then. So it's kind of an example of arbitrary strictness. It was strictness that really wasn't needed. I mean, it would have been fine to let me watch the Olympics for 15 minutes. Well, anyhow, they got done yelling at me, eventually went to sleep. I kind of forgot about it for a long time, but about 4 years ago, when I was praying about this situation with God, I felt like I had to do certain things. I said, "I know you're not arbitrarily strict, but that's what it feels like." I said, "You know, remember that time back when I was 10 and a half? I didn't get to watch the Olympics? That's what this feels like. It feels like that. I know it's not, you're not that way, but I'm just sorry I feel that way. Please help me get over it." Well, the next day, nobody was home. I watched something on the History Channel. I don't even remember what it was, but it was an hour. I TiVoed it. It was on for an hour, and it ended 15 minutes early. And I said, "What are they going to do with the other 15 minutes?" It was a black and white newsreel showing the highlights of the 64 Olympics. It was as if God said to me, "I'm not arbitrarily strict. I would have let you watch it." So those kind of experiences, again, they're not necessarily something that would make someone else believe, but they confirm belief in me. Again, to repeat myself one more time, my belief is 90% on scientific evidence, 10% on faith. I trust Jesus just like I trust Stacy Bell. Well, I actually trust Jesus even more. And then experiences for me were not part of the initial belief, but they've helped confirm it. So I'll just close with this. This is there's a very popular Bible passage where Jesus said it was easier for a rich man, or easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. And when I decided, okay, I am going to actually believe in this God of the Bible and Jesus, the first thing I had to do was say, okay, I can never be good enough for God in my own strength. And if even a rich person, who at that time they thought the rich people were the ones that had all the into God, and Jesus basically told them, no, even they can't get into heaven just based on how good they are. So I had to say, okay, God, I accept that I can never be good enough for you in my own strength. I accept that Jesus died on the cross to forgive me of my sins, and that was the start of, and it's a free gift that I can't earn, and that was the start of my relationship with God. So I will stop there, and I'll be glad to answer or try to answer some questions.